The History of Sigmar Heldenhammer. In the imperial calendar IC, which bases its starting date upon the coronation of Sigmar by the Jarl Ulrich, Sigmar is believed to have been born -30 IC in what is now the northern areas of the Reichland, ruled by the Unberogen, one of the most powerful tribes of ancient times, rivaled only by the Teutogens and chaos-worshipping Norssei to their north. His father was the legendary warrior king Bjorn Unberogen, son of Redmane Dragor, who purged the flesh-eating Skriani from the lands of men in an age long gone. The birth of the royal son was a cause for much celebration amongst the Unberogen, and Bjorn ordered great feasting to be held to honor the gods for this blessing. While wise men came from all around the Unberogen holdings to speak of the portents they had witnessed that would affect the child's birth, in the end, however, it was when old Drego, the oldest and wisest of the wise men, had gutted a hare and read its entrails that the truth of the signs became apparent. For it was found that with the coming of childbirth, both mother and son would die. Pale with fear, Bjorn gathered his trusted bodyguard to journey to the domain of the hag-woman of Brackenwalch, an ancient sea-ress who alone had the knowledge to save the family of the Unberogen king. Bjorn and his retinue journeyed to the Brackenwalch, a place no man dared, filled with darkling things, and it was said its winding paths led to the underworlds of the demon gods of the Norssei. At the marsh, the Unberogans abandoned the cart they had placed Bjorn's wife Griselda, for the ground was too treacherous. To the heart of the marsh they journeyed, where the seer was reputed to dwell. They found nothing there, save her shack and cauldron. The hardened warriors started when they noticed clear blue eyes peering at them from the broth, and then they noticed human bones strewn about the abode. The orcs had boiled the crone alive in her own cauldron. From all sides the orcs came, howling and baying, drawn by the scent of Griselda's blood and eager to shed yet more. Bjorn, roaring a terrible battle cry, no less fearsome than the cries of the orcs, launched himself into the fray, and fought as only a man defending that which he cherished could, slaying many orcs at a time with great sweeps of his legendary axe, Soul Taker. Eventually, he closed in with the orcish chieftain, a massive, brutal creature towering above all others in the battlefield. Man and orc, fiercest of rivals, now locked in mortal combat until Bjorn smashed the orc to the ground and tore open his throat with his dagger. The battle had been won, but many of Bjorn's royal guard were slain, and it was far too late to save his wife. Bjorn rushed to Griselda's side, only to find her dead from blood loss. Weeping, he nonetheless spied an infant stirring at her feet, wallowing in the mingled blood of human and orc. Sorrowful at the death of his love, yet overjoyed at the birth of his son, the grieving king raised the infant into the air as a mighty peal of thunder cracked the sky, and the great comet lit the night with twin fiery tails. Thus was born Sigmar Unberogen, who had entered the world with the sound of battle in his ears and the feel of orcish blood upon his flesh. The years went on, and Sigmar grew to become a fierce and strong warrior. Before he had reached even the cusp of manhood, he was already a capable and respected fighter, bringing much pride to his father. He forged long-lasting friendship with 3 fellow tribesmen, Wolfgard Krieger, Pendrak, and Trinovantes. These 3 warriors would eventually become his sword brothers, and would follow him on his path to unite the tribes. One summer, on the day before his 10th year, Sigmar sparred against Wolfgard. The latter was 3 years older, as well as taller and stronger, and defeated the Unberogen prince. Incensed at his humiliation, Sigmar swung the smelting hammer he used as his weapon when Wolfgard's back was turned, breaking the older boy's arm. At the sight of his friend's agony, Sigmar's rage was swept away and replaced with horror at what he had done. and it was then he was taken by his father and taught an important piece of wisdom. All men feel anger, but to become a great leader, you must master it, the mighty king said. Today, you vented your anger upon one who did not deserve it. Learn to direct your strength for the good of your people, not their ill. With that, Bjorn set Sigmar upon his dooming day, where he would stand amidst the tombs of his fathers and hear their wisdom, that he might learn to forge his future as king. Within those tombs, he offered up a bull's heart in honor of Mor. Behind him, the portal through which he had entered had been sealed by a boulder. Trapped, Sigmar made a prayer to mighty Ulrich and his honored ancestors, offering them all that he was if they would save him, perishing unfulfilled. The future king spied a shaft of light breaking through the dark rock. Exerting his already fearsome strength, young Sigmar nudged the great boulder blocking his escape away. He staggered away from the halls of his ancestors, a thanks to Ulrich on his lips. He reached the summit of the hill and beheld with clarity the lands of his fathers in their full. What he saw made his heart balk. Sigmar beheld the frailty and uncertainty. He saw men huddled together, forever afraid, forever vulnerable. Scattered villages like merciful islands spread out amidst a sea of darkness, and enemies drawing ever closer. He saw the disparate nature of the sons of men, the inherent weakness born of jealousy, distrust, and ambition. He remembered his rage and the crack as Wolfgard's arm broke under his assault, and in that unworthy act he saw the doom of men. With the voices of his honored forefathers whispering in his ears, and the courage of Ulrich swelling in his breast, Sigmar knew what had to be done. Sigmar stepped into his destiny without hesitation. His mission to unite the tribes of men into an everlasting empire, born on the foundations of strength and honor. On that day, the HELDENHAMMER was born. As the young warrior prince stood ready to brave the perils of his destiny, Sigmar came to vanquish his first true challenge at the cusp of his youth. In the legends of his people and that of his grandfather, King Dragor Redmane, a curse had been laid upon the Unberogans for failing to offer up sacrifices to mighty Tal during an extremely bountiful hunt. In his ire, a great beast known as Black Tusk the Boar had killed Sweyn Oakhart, brother to King Dragor Redmane, who was the one who enacted the first great hunt, and now tries to go on one more in hopes of appeasing the anger Tal. He returned barely alive, his stomach stuffed with leaves to stop his innards from falling out. A sacrifice was finally made, and King Redmane buried his dead brother in the burial tomb of their people, their debt to the gods finally paid. The beast is said to still dwell along the banks of the river Skane, and so did Sigmar and his closest companions, the courageous Wulfgard, the skillful Trivonates, and the wise Pendrach went on their journey towards those forbidden banks. Sigmar eased their concerns that they are simply going out to fish, but for the young boy Sigmar, his quarry was the infamous Black Tusk. There, upon the river Skane, the young boy stood upon the river waters, the fish here being so plentiful due to the intimidating presence of old Black Tusk. As the day passed on and the boys laughed and played, a shadow soon loomed over them. Growing as large as a horse, the fearsome boar known as Black Tusk stared angrily at the youths. The boys backed away and soon swam across the river as the boar inched forward, but it was only Sigmar who stood his ground. As Black Tusk charged towards him, head lowered, Sigmar held out his hand and stared Black Tusk directly in the eye. As the beast was upon him, Black Tusk faltered and then stopped when its snout was almost touching Sigmar's hand. Whispering to the beast, Sigmar slowly touched the boar's snout and slowly moved around him towards his bristly neck. With a jerk, Sigmar removed his spear which was lodged into its back, a spear that was probably struck by his great-uncle long ago. With a nod, the beast turned towards the banks and trotted into the trees. Thus did Sigmar's first challenge was not won by bloodshed, but by words and deeds, a characteristic which will mark him for the rest of his history. The years went by, and Sigmar grew yet more fearsome. His vision of a united, prosperous, and mighty future for his people driving him on. In time, he grew to be the greatest warrior of the Unbroken, even before attaining his shield in battle. At the age of 15, Sigmar led a retaliatory raid upon a green-skinned tribe in retribution for their prior attack on an Unbroken holding. The chieftain of these beasts was a mighty Black Orc war boss known as Vagras Headstomper. By chance, the Orcish warband had made prisoners of the then High King of the Dwarfs, Kurgan Ironbeard, as well as his kinsmen, as they were en route to meet with the Stoneheart dwarf clan of the south. The Unberogans cornered the Orcs, unwittingly coming to the rescue of the dwarfs as well. This meeting would be a turning point in man's history. In the battle that transpired, Kurgan Ironbeard bore witness to this young human prince facing down the Black Orc. Despite young Sigmar's mighty strength, every killing blow his bronze sword had made was turned aside by the armor of the Orc, and every blow from its flaming axe came all too close to ending his young life. Ironbeard broke free of his bonds and fought his way to Vagras's tent, where he kept his pick of the Dwarf King's possessions, including the mighty hammer Galmaraz, the splitter of skulls. Kurgan threw the hammer towards Sigmar, cursing the Orcs with every curse known to dwarf kind. Sigmar caught the ancient weapon, and the tide turned from the Unbroken. Sigmar assaulted the Orc with mighty strikes of his hammer, the fury of his blows bringing the hulking beast down to a single knee. With the final strike, Sigmar smashed the Orc's skull to bloody shards, a mighty feat even for a warrior wielding a weapon forged with dwarven skill. With the close of the battle, their holdings avenged, Sigmar attempted to return the hammer to the High King. In that moment, a historical act came about, one unheard of in all the annals of both men and dwarves, and forever forged an unbreakable bond of friendship between the men of the lands west of the mountains and the dwarven kingdom of Karazankor. King Kurgan Ironbeard gifted the ancient hammer Galmaraz to Sigmar. It was a unique happening for a unique weapon, for the power of Galmaraz is old, ancient even to the dwarfs, and it is said of the weapon that it itself possesses a will of its own, and it actively chooses those who are to bear it into battle. Indeed, as fate would have it, the hammer was always Sigmar's, and had been waiting for the day the warrior would claim it. The Dwarven King looked upon Sigmar and saw within him power, honor, courage, and ability without parallel, and knew that Galmaraz was rightfully his. And he also reasoned that an ancient runic weapon was fitting payment for saving the life of a Dwarven king. From then on, the Dwarven nations and the Unbroken clans were the most steadfast of allies. At the start of his 15th year, Sigmar was now charged with earning his shield, an important rite of passage for the men of the ancient tribes, as this symbolized the progression into full manhood. Sigmar would now lead a true army of his fellow tribesmen into battle against the enemies of the Unbroken. For once again, the Orcs of the mountains laid waste to the holdings of men, this time led by a war boss known as Bone Crusher. Sigmar had long stared death in the eye and smiled back at it, but the challenge before him made him fear. For Sigmar now had the lives of his fellow men in his hands, and was in a position to be judged by his fellow warriors. He had led men in battle before, but none of such magnitude as this. His father saw these things and assured him, telling him it was the charge of men to face fear and overcome it, and that the same serpent had gnawed at his belly when Sigmar's grandfather, Redmane Dragor, had sent him out to earn his own shield. Bjorn had also told his son that he knew that his deeds would be legend one day, and that men would speak his name in awed whispers long after his passing. Presenting his son a bronze-studded shield, Bjorn told him to either come back with it or upon it. Offering their blood sacrifices to Ulrich, the Unberogans feasted and caroused, knowing that for many, Tomorrow would be their final day. The Unberogen rode to Astophen and built a camp near the beleaguered town and sent scouts to learn of the enemy's position. The Orcish army was 2,000 strong in all and was led by a towering Orcish warboss clad in black armor with a massive war axe. Here was Grimgut's Bone Crusher, who with a mighty throw of his weapon towards the Astophen gate made the signal for the mob to begin the siege. Sigmar and his warriors then rode down the slope of his hill. The warrior prince had cast aside all armor to show his contempt for the orcs. He held a great iron spear in one hand, with a single throw of it impaled 2 orcs. The orcs were caught unprepared by the cavalry charge, and their lines were bent back and made to waver. However, every orc slain had another ready, and eager to take its place, and for all the fury of the Unberogen charge, the orcish line held. Pendrag led a company of horse archers down another slope and met the orcs on their other flank, hammering into them with arrow after arrow. This time, however, the orcs reacted, and their crude shield wall broke to allow their warriors to chase the now retreating horsemen. Eventually, the orcs began to retake their lost ground, and it was now that Sigmar revealed his true plan. With 2 blasts of a war horn as the signal, Sigmar's warriors broke from the battlefield back to the war camp, while another force of Unberogen warriors, serving as the army's rear guard, formed up at Astophen Bridge and readied their axes to face the onrushing orc hordes. The Unberogans replaced their weapons and took up fresh remounts at the base, and then charged back to the fight without second thought, knowing their time was being bought with the blood of friends and sword brothers. It was the noble Trinovantes who led the rear guard, fighting the orcs as if the spirit of Ulrich filled him on that battlefield. Many orcs did he and his brave warriors slay, until they fell in heaps about them. However, the Unberogans were soon overwhelmed, and Trinovantes was slain in single combat with warboss Bone Crusher. Seeing his long-time ally die to the orc warlord's axe, Sigmar let loose a howl of terrible rage as he closed in with the orc, leaping from his saddle and swinging his hammer in a single, devastating arc that obliterated the orc warlord's skull. With that, Sigmar and his warriors slaughtered the remaining orcs with vicious joy, roaring out brutal supplications to their god Ulrich. On that day, Sigmar had defeated a foe many times his own number, had sent a trusted friend to his death, and filled his heart with burning hatred for the enemies of men. His shield earned, Sigmar and his warriors returned back to Reichdorf in glory. Thus did Sigmar return to the Unberogen capital of Reichdorf, modern-day Altdorf, draped in victory and glory, having broken a massive orc army of 2,000 strong and saved the village of Astophen from certain destruction. Nevertheless, the death of Trinovantes weighed heavily on Sigmar, and he mourned dearly for his lost friend. After interring the fallen, including brave Trinovantes, into the Warriors' Hill, the great tomb of the Unberogen, King Bjorn ordered a celebration of the victory. Unto this celebration came King Marbad of the Andals, a staunch ally to the Unberogen and sword brother of King Bjorn. In the company of these 2 kings did Sigmar recount the deeds of the heroes of Astophen and his own vision of an empire. Of him, the Andal remarked, he was at the very least courageous. However, Sigmar's meteoric rise to glory caused him to make enemies within the Unberogen tribe, particularly the swordsman Geryon, twin brother of Trinovantes, who harbored great hatred for Sigmar, for in his mind, leading his brother to his death by ordering him to make that distraction at Astophen Bridge. Sigmar undertook a purging of the terrible beastmen who dwelt in the expansive forests of the Unberogen lands, making the tribal holdings safe in the name of his father, the king, slaying entire tribes of the beasts single-handed, and avenging their prior depredations on the villages of not only the Unberogans, but also of the other tribes. It was not only beasts and other foul creatures Sigmar overcame, but also the warriors of the other tribes, as Teutogan raiders burned and pillaged northernmost Unberogen holdings, looting villages and stealing cattle. With the aid of the dwarfs, particularly the legendary forge master Alaric the Mad, the Unberogans produced countless suits of fine iron armor and strong iron swords and axes to arm the Unberogan warriors. These weapons would later be integral to allowing the Unberogan to overcome the terror charging down from the far north. Slaughtering their way through Dosi's tribal lands, and then making their way to invade the lands of the Turingians and Telutans, the mighty Norssei emerged from their frozen kingdom to make all before them a sacrifice to the dark gods. The Turingians and Telutans put aside their long territorial rivalry to resist the Northmen, but not even the combined strength of two tribes could withstand the unquenchable fury of the Norssei hordes. Not even the fierce Teutogans were willing to raid out against the Norsemen, and the power-hungry Artur elected to lie in wait until after the Norssei had annihilated his northern neighbours, desiring to take the lands of the Turingians and Telutans after the Norssei destroyed them for him. As the Teutogans would not dare risk themselves against the Norssei, the Turingians and Telutans were forced to look further south for support. King Aloyses of the Turingians and King Krugar of the Telutans both sent their respective emissaries Ebrulf and Nocta to the court of King Bjorn, warning him of the peril to the north and beseeching the aid of the mighty Unberogans. In return, they offered the sword oaths of their respective chieftains, an eternal oath of friendship and unconditional aid to King Bjorn and his heirs if he would deliver them the terror of the Northmen. King Bjorn, after conferring with his advisors, the learned Eoforth and Elfgeir, Marshal of the Reich, agreed to aid the beleaguered tribes, knowing that after they had finished with the Turingians and Telutans, the Norssei would then sweep south unopposed, destroying all in their path, including the Unberogan. Sigmar was not part of the grand muster that followed, as his father had left him with the charge of protecting the land, while many of the tribe's warriors were marching north. Ever the dutiful son, he worked to defend his father's kingdom, as well as train men to look to their own defense in times of conflict, if he could not be there in time to protect them. Such was the case when Arthur's Teutogans savagely raided the Unberogan town of Ubersreich. Sigmar swore by Ulrich that when the warriors returned, he would make a terrible reckoning with the northern king. In the north, the combined forces of the Telutans, Turingians, and Unberogans fought the Norssei. Though the Norse were ferocious warriors of unparalleled strength and skill, their vicious might was countered by the superior numbers and discipline of the southern tribes. Despite this, the cost had been high to drive the Norssei back to their frozen kingdom across the seas, and many thousands of southern tribesmen had fallen to their fury. At the final battle against the Norssei, the southern tribes fought an uphill battle against the remnants of the Norssei army, including King Bjorn himself, who fought the Norssei king, a terrible champion of Khorne, clad in red steel and wielding a flaming sword in single combat. Though bloodied and near death, King Bjorn managed to decapitate the Chaos champion with a great swing of his war axe, sending the champion's head and his war banner falling to the ground. The sight drove what remained of the Norssei to flung themselves at the battered Bjorn, and soon the Unberogan king fell into the ground with a dozen sword blows and spears thrust upon his body. Even before he'd learned of the loss of his father, Sigmar was going to feel the loss of his one and only true lover, a beautiful Unberogan woman named Ravenna. The beloved older sister of both Trinovantes and Geryon, Ravenna was the only woman Sigmar had ever truly loved, and it is said that if things were different, she would have been his wife and be together for the rest of their lives. When the two lovers were alone within the river Reich, Geryon, consumed by grief at the loss of his brother, ambushed the young Unberogan prince and poisoned him with a slash of his coated sword. As the life slowly drained from Sigmar, Ravenna threw herself at Geryon, but in his blind rage, Geryon stabbed Ravenna, his own sister, by mistake. Seeing her death, Sigmar was consumed by an indomitable rage and rushed towards the grief-stricken Geryon and began to choke the life out of him. Yet the poison still sapped at Sigmar's strength, and as Geryon struggled, a dark power consumed his entire body, and the possessed Geryon threw Sigmar onto the river. As darkness engulfed his mind, Sigmar fell into unconsciousness. Then Sigmar awoke, within a bleak world of ashen grey. The young unbroken prince wandered this grey land for how long Sigmar could not say, until a pack of shadowy humanoids came upon him. With a golden sword in his hand, Sigmar fought valorously against these unnatural foes, yet as the last of the fell creatures let out a howling screech which forced Sigmar to his knees, where he stood helplessly before the creature's own black blade, a double-bladed axe blocked the creature's swing. With one stroke, Bjorn Unbrogen killed the creature and embraced his son in his large arms. Reunited, Bjorn told Sigmar that they needed to go towards a large black gate that loomed in the distance, where they were met by a host of shadowy monsters that were once men. It was then that the true meaning of this journey came to Sigmar. He was near dead, and that they are within the doorsteps to Mor's kingdom. A tall warrior strode out, and Bjorn instantly recognized him as the Norssei king he'd slain. The Chaos champion told him that Sigmar must pass from the world of the living, for the dark gods command his death to be so. However, Bjorn knew that couldn't happen, for he made a solemn vow long ago. The hag woman of Brackenwalch, who was thought to have died when Sigmar was born many years ago, came to Bjorn the day Sigmar returned from the Battle of Astophen. She told Bjorn that the fate of mankind rested upon Sigmar's shoulder, and that should he live, the race of man will rise to glory and mastery of the land, sea, and sky. Yet should he die, then mankind is doomed to damnation, and the world will end in blood and fire. And so Bjorn stood defiantly against the dark god's wishes, and as he did so, shapes began to appear around him as the ghost of dead unbroken warriors stood ready to fight one last time for their king. The battle was a close thing, but with the aid of Sigmar, now wielding his golden hammer Galmeraz, the battle was never in doubt. As the darkness dissipated, the Unbrogen stood before the whirling darkness of Mor's gate. One by one, the Unbrogen ghosts passed to the afterlife, but Bjorn waited for a moment longer to give his son a pendant that he wore, giving him his last parting words. Soon, Bjorn's form grew faint, becoming like the ghostly Unbrogen warriors as well. Soon, Sigmar was the only one left behind, and once all of the ghosts had passed, the portal dissipated. Sigmar took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and he awoke in the lands of the living, agony rippling across his near-dead body. With the death of his father, Sigmar ascended to leadership of the Unbrogen. No sooner than his father had been laid in the warrior's hill, that the grieving son had sworn to slaughter his father's enemies. In time, Sigmar marched north with a massive army, calling upon the sworn oaths of King Krugar and King Aloysius, and thus adding their own musters to his own. He had also endeavoured to bring the Teutogens into this final push against the Norssei, but King Artur remained withdrawn from such foreign affairs. Indeed, Teutogen raiders even waylaid Sigmar's army as they passed through the land of the Fauschlag. In the north, Sigmar lifted the Norssei siege of the Adosi's capital and gained the support of King Volfilla of the Adosis, who eagerly lent his own armies to aid in finally putting an end to the depredations of the raiders who daily ravaged his people. Against the untold numbers of Sigmar's army, not even the ferocity of the Norssei could prevail, and they were decisively defeated and driven towards the northern coastline. There, as the remains of the Norssei people clambered upon their wolf ships with their women and children, Sigmar swore to all the gods that he would ensure that none of them would survive. With the aid of the Unbroggen and Udosi's archers and the battery of catapults, Sigmar ordered flaming arrows to be shot at the fleeing masses. Thousands of bodies of men, women and children filled the sandy coast of the north, with many more bodies filling the waters and staining it red with blood. While the other tribes became awestruck at the carnage of an entire people, the Udosis were heard to be howling with joy and satisfaction. Large boneyards of wolf ships were scattered all along the coast, and it seemed that not a single Norssei survived the massacre. With this act, Sigmar had casually enacted the near-total extinction of an entire tribal race. But Sigmar knew that these men deserved no amount of pity or remorse, for their kind sought to only inflict suffering and misery in service of their cruel and uncaring gods. The Norssei had no place within his dreams of an empire, and the blood payment that their earlier invasions had inflicted upon the tribes of the south had been paid tenfold. Yet despite everything he had done, a small scattered band of wolf ships escaped the carnage, and made landfall upon the frozen shores of Norssei. From there, they huddled inside the husk of their ships, weathering the horrific blizzards, and gathered strength, hoping to one day return down south and enact their vengeance upon Sigmar's people and begin the vicious cycle of misery once again. With the threat of the Norssei addressed for a time, Sigmar turned his attentions towards his dream of an empire. Through a string of heroic battles and tense negotiations, Sigmar succeeded in bringing the tribes under his rule. Having already gained the loyalty of the Turingians, Telutan, and Udosis through their loyalty to his father, Sigmar sought to encompass his bonds of brotherhood through all the tribes within the lands. Such alliances would provide the base for how he would bring the tribes together, as the heroism of Bjorn had won the respect of nearly all who dwelt in the Reich Basin. Sigmar made no attempt to bring the Ropsmen into the empire, however, as they were so far north and east that they were, for all intents and purposes, the people of a different land altogether. Another limitation of Sigmar's influence was that it did not stretch far enough to bring the Ungol horse tribes into the empire, but the tribes of the Reich continued to maintain passable enough relations with them. The tribes of the Reich who continued to outright refuse Sigmar's call for unity were destroyed outright, such as the now extinct and almost forgotten Fryking's tribe. Now, Sigmar sought to encompass the greatest of the barbarian kingdoms, the fierce Turingians, the wild Assaborns, the berserk Turingians, and the fast Burgundians. Sigmar surrounded the Fauschlag with a great army, and called upon Arthur to account for the slaughter of Ubersreich. Down from the great spire rode Mercer, warrior eternal of the Ulrichsburg, and trusted second of the Teutogen kings. It sat ill with Mercer that his king did not come forth himself to cast out the Unbroggens, and Sigmar, ever a capable judge of men, sensed this. Mercer declared that any army that dared assault the fastness of the Teutogens would shatter upon its towering walls. Sigmar, in turn, declared that if Arthur failed to descend from his rock in a single day and explain himself, then he would scale the stone walls of the Fauschlag and break open his skull in full view of his people. Casting off armor, he and his trusted bodyguard Alfgeir scaled the impossible height of the Fauschlag and made their way to the city of the Teutogens. Arriving at the center of the city, a great ring of towering menhirs around the massive plume of silver fire, pure as snow blazing from the ground, the flame of Ulrich. There knelt the mighty Arthur, offering prayers to the wolf god of winter. There, before Ulrich's fire, Sigmar called Arthur to account for his slaughter of Unbroggen villages while his father defended the north from the Norssei. Arthur callously rebuffed the Unbroggen's aspersions and insulted the young king, claiming he would have done the same had their positions been reversed. Angered, Sigmar challenged Arthur to single combat before Ulrich's flame, and in the sight of the wolf priests, his servants on earth. Before such witnesses, no man could refuse an honourable call to battle and expect to retain favour with the war god. Arthur drew his mighty weapon, the dragon sword of Caladvalsh, a magical blade coated with hoarfrost said to have been forged from frozen lightning by a shaman of ancient lore from a land across the seas. The two kings fought each other, evenly matched, until Arthur managed to force Sigmar into the flame of Ulrich. It is said that in that Sigmar brushed with the power of his god, and that Ulrich judged his life's worth and protected him from the searing flames and filled him with the might of winter. When Sigmar emerged, he felt furious power fill him. The head of his hammer was wreathed in cold fire, and ghostly tendrils of mist clung to him as if he had emerged from the coldest glacier. When he roared, it was the howl of a wolf that broke from his throat, not the bellow of a mortal man. Awed by this, Arthur could not defend himself from Sigmar's furious attacks, and Caladvalsh's blade was shattered by a single strike of Gul Miraz. Sigmar's next blow smashed Arthur's skull to bloody shards. With that victory, Sigmar became king of the Teutogons by right of conquest. Sigmar held the sword oaths of the Cherusans, Telutans, Udoses, and now the Teutogon. However, the tribes of the Assaborns, whom the Unbrogen had friendly relations with, were nonetheless not allied to Sigmar's growing confederation. Seeing no hostilities between their tribes, Sigmar sought a diplomatic approach for the famed warrior queen Freya of the Assaborns. After having gifted King Kruger and the Telutans with fine suits of dwarf forge armor and weapons, further strengthening their ties with Sigmar's confederation, the king of the Unbrogen led a small column of his warriors and headed towards the plains of the Assaborn homeland. Alongside him came his closest friends and advisors. Wolfgard and Pendrag felt that this mission was foolish, but King Sigmar was determined to ensure that no bloodshed is needed to bring them to the fold. As they came upon the open plains of Assaborn territory, a small army of nearly 300 Assaborn warriors and a fleet of chariots intercepted them. Yet both the Assaborns and Unbrogans held their hands, and Sigmar only asked to be taken to their queen. Accepting King Sigmar's request under the term that his army would stay where they were and that they'd be blindfolded, the Assaborn presented King Sigmar to Queen Freya. Within her throne room, King Sigmar presented to the warrior queen gifts of armor and steel, as well as stubs of the finest horses within the stables of the Unbrogen lands. Queen Freya was particularly impressed with these gifts, and after a lengthy proposal from Sigmar, came to accept the benefit of brotherhood with the tribes to her west. However, to seal the deal, the Queen of the Assaborns asked Sigmar to be with her for one night. Seeing no other option, Sigmar agreed to the terms, and the Assaborn finally joined his empire. Next, Sigmar sought to bind the dreaded Turingians to his banner. The Berserkers were a proud, warlike people, fiercely independent and unwilling to bend their knee to any king who had not earned their obedience through combat. Though Sigmar had exhausted every diplomatic avenue open to him, the Turingians remained obstinate and bent on bringing the empire to battle. Though all knew that the battle was merely a formality, as King Otwin could not maintain power over such a warlike race without fighting for independence to the last, it still sat ill with Sigmar that he had to spill the blood of his people. The imperial armies faced the Turingians in their homeland of the Drakvald, their howling audible even at the very threshold of their lands. At these sounds, the Emperor's warriors made the sign of the horns, for such was the terror inspired by the roars of the Berserkers. Though they fought with savage bravery eclipsed only by the Norssei, the outcome of this battle was never in doubt. The Turingian Berserkers were outmatched 2-1 by Sigmar's armies, and the Emperor had never tasted defeat. In the battle, Sigmar faced the fearsome Ulfdar, who would later become a famed heroine of the Battle of Blackfire Pass, and defeated her. More importantly, he clashed with King Otwin as their respective retinues came blade to blade with each other on the field. the Berserker King was the first to issue a challenge. Bellowing a cry of blood and honor, daring Sigmar to fight him. In full view of his warriors, Sigmar raised Galmeraz in acceptance of the challenge. The two kings faced each other in a clash of fire and steel, the mighty axe of the Turingian kings matched against the ancient warhammer of the mountain folk. Sigmar drove Otwin to his knees, and with his two hands choked the berserker fury from him until he became lucid. With his hands still on Otwin's throat, Sigmar offered the Turingian a choice. Either offer up his sword oath and join Sigmar's company of warriors, and together they would forge the empire that would hold back the darkness, or he would make a charnel house of the Drakvald for the Turingian people. King Otwin laughed aloud at this proposal, his honour satisfied by the battle, then accepted Sigmar's offer of brotherhood, and remarked that the Unberogen was a man with whom to walk the road to Ulric's halls. With that, King Otwin and his fearsome people pledged allegiance to the empire. To the southeast of the Unberogen lands lay the territories of the Burgundians, in what is now Avoland. The Burgundians at a time remained aloof from the affairs of the Unberogans, but boasted great trade with their neighbours. In time they grew affluent, and Sigmar's advisers warned that this burgeoning power may in time prove a great threat to his own lands, for no treaty kept the two tribes at accord. He called his advisers and friends to his side, Eoforth, Elfgeir, Wolfgard, and Pendrag, and asked for their wisdom. Some spoke of taking a great army to defeat the Burgundians. Others spoke of assassinating King Sigurd and his sons. Sigmar knew, however, that the Burgundians could not be brought to the empire through violence or coercion, and nor did he wish such, for he did not wish to be known as a tyrant, for the works of tyrants are often destroyed by those they subjugate. Instead, Sigmar said he would ride to Sigurdheim himself and forge a treaty with the folk there. Through forests and rolling plains he travelled to the prosperous lands of the Burgundians, bordering the threatening eastern peaks that were the domain of greenskins, and his admiration for the hardy Burgundians grew with every moment he spent there. The great city of the Burgundians rested proudly upon a rocky hill, surrounded by a stout stone wall. He entered the great hall of King Sigurd, a far cry from the fire-lit austerity of his own hall in Reichdorf. King Sigmar was received politely, yet guardedly, and was asked to state his business. Sigmar spoke of the need for unity, of how the wolves gathered strength while the tribes fought and died over meaningless animosities, of how the common ancestry of men was to bind them together in brotherhood, and of how all men of honor were bound to aid their neighbors without reserve when threatened. This, he said, was the foundation of the empire he strove for. King Sigurd was a wily man, who used words to weave a net around others. Hearing Sigmar's lofty ideals, he decided to test the king's commitment to the brotherhood he spoke of, and charged Sigmar to deliver his people from an ancient evil, a dragon ogre, a beast of elder days that had destroyed entire cities of the Burgundian territories unimpeded, for no force the southeastern tribe could bring to bear could defeat it. The great city of Kreilheim had already been left smashed and burning by the beast. Sigmar took it upon himself to kill the dragon ogre, and scale the daunting mountains where it made its dwelling, and brought it to battle. The creature was a thing of flesh and blood, yet it was mightier and older than even the ancient mountains it claimed as its abode. In an epic battle where hammer and axe clashed and rent apart the stone of the peaks, Sigmar found purchase upon his enemy's skull and smote Skaranorak with a single strike of Galmeraz, destroying the beast once and for all, and proving his strength before Ulric. Though victorious, Sigmar's heart wept for the death of so mighty an adversary. In its honor, Sigmar skinned the beast and fashioned a magnificent cloak from its hide, able to turn aside a blade as well as any armor of iron. Sigmar returned to Sigurdheim with the skull of the dragon ogre as proof of his mighty deed. King Sigurd was moved by this, as he was when Sigmar pledged to deliver the Burgundians without reservation. The Burgundian king had thought that Sigmar had sought merely to enslave the men of the Reich with high ideals, but realized his error when he beheld Sigmar's selflessness. He confessed his duplicity to Sigmar and spoke of how tortured he was by the base deception he had played out. Sigmar easily forgave Sigurd then and there, and the Burgundian pledged himself without rancor to the greater king, offering Sigmar his sword oaths and those of the Merogans and Menogoths, whose kings owed fealty to the Burgundians. In one fell swoop, all the southern tribes had now joined the empire. The period following the unification of the majority of the tribes was one of respite for the emperor, and he turned his attention towards the development of infrastructure. Soon, the armies of the empire were even better trained and equipped, new roads were created between the tribal settlements, new ore deposits were found, and fortresses were built to safeguard the borders of the burgeoning dominion. As ever, the greenskins sought to put it aflame, for a horde of the creatures had poured down from the peaks and raided the territories of the Ostrogoths to the northeast. As was their way, no plunder had been gathered from the conquered lands of the Ostrogoths, nor had any prisoners been taken. The greenskins had simply slaughtered an entire race for the sheer love of the deed. In desperation, King Adelhard sent an emissary, known as Galin Veniva, to Sigmar, now the most powerful king in the land, and offered him his fealty in exchange for aid against the Orcs, offering Sigmar Ostvarath, the ancient blade of the Ostrogoth kings, as tribute. Sigmar, seeing a chance to complete his unification of the Reich Bassin, agreed to aid the northeastern tribe, and refused to take Ostvarath, stating that King Adelhard would have need of the blade of his fathers in the coming days. Sigmar called upon the sword oaths of his brother kings and marshalled an army to defeat the coming greenskins at the rivers Ava and Ster. For 2 years the imperial army fought the Orcs, but the true bulk of the horde was held back by the empire's doughty allies, the dwarfs. The High King's warriors had held back advancing greenskin tribes from pushing further into Adelhard's lands, though eventually the dwarf army was forced to pull back to defend their own mountain cities. The time bought by the sting of their axes had not been wasted, however, as it allowed King Adelhard to link his armies with Cherusans, Telutans, and Assaborns and Unbrogen White Wolves and smash the Orcs at Black Road, driving them back to the mountains. This allowed time for Sigmar to march north with a muster of 50,000 and call on the aid of his old ally, King Kurgan Ironbeard. The Orcs were delivered a conclusive defeat at the banks of the river Avar itself, when the greenskin horde was crushed between the human and dwarf armies. The greenskin army fled from the Ostrogoth lands and back over Blackfire Pass. This, however, would only serve as the storm before the hurricane. For a time, the lands of Sigmar enjoyed peace. However, the southern regions lay in ruin. Efforts were made to rebuild them, but war came too soon for them to be completed. Envoys of King Ironbeard arrived with news of an Orc horde of such monumental scale as to eclipse all others combined that came before it, massing in the forsaken lands east of the mountains, making for the now legendary Blackfire Pass, intent on destroying the races of dwarf and man forever. This Sigmar would not allow. He summoned all his brother kings to the Golden Hall of King Sigurd, as the Burgundian lands lay adjacent to the pass, to a grand meeting now known as the Council of 11, known as such due to the fact that the Teutones and Bretonii were not represented, as they had refused to come to Sigmar's aid. There, the kings conferred of how they would face this apocalyptic threat. Some of the assembled kings realized that the only path was to unite into one great host, placing the overall command of the army under Sigmar. Others, however, would not bring themselves to relinquish command over their own warriors to another king, and remained obstinate. Soon, dissension and argument arose between the assembled warlords. Sigmar saw this and was filled with contempt, silencing the dissent with a word. He denounced the shamefulness of their squabbles, while a lesser race stood united and poised to destroy humanity. With a tone that brokered no argument, Sigmar told the kings of how if they did not stand together at this crucial juncture, mankind would be destroyed. It was Marbad of the Andals, who was a friend to Sigmar's father, and then a friend to Sigmar himself, who first stood up and confirmed his allegiance to the unbroken king, laying his elvish blade, Ulfshard, beside Galmeraz. The other kings rose up and followed suit, pledging their obedience to the son of Bjorn. With that, the kings withdrew to their lands and girded for war. It was in -1 IC that man and dwarf finally joined each other's host at Blackfire Pass, brought together by ties of friendship and honor, and driven by the terrible knowledge that if they were to fail, their kingdoms would be destroyed and their families led to slavery and death. This assembled army was known as Sigmar's Hammer, for with it he would strike such a blow upon the orcs as to shatter their strength for an age and secure the lands of men for all time. On the eve of the battle, Sigmar is said to have experienced a dream where he stood by Ulric's side and joined him in drinking the blood of his enemies, while bloody wolves circled him and howled. It was a good omen. The first Battle of Blackfire Pass forever stands testament to the courage and military genius of Sigmar, who recognized the inherent tactical advantage of setting up his forces at the pass's most narrow corridor, in order to counter the greenskins' indisputable advantage of numbers. 2 miles wide, spanning the length of the pass, the ranks of Sigmar's armies were assembled tightly, for if there was even the slightest give in the shield wall, it would be the undoing of men. Rows of boulders lined the sheer walls of the pass, some say having been erected by the ancients in the honor of the gods. Sigmar had them torn down and used to fortify the battle line. Warbands formed up their shield wall between the boulders, their flanks secured by solid rocks, and splitting the line so that if one warband was broken and made to flee, it was less likely to affect the rest of the line. It also reduced the frontage of Sigmar's army, ensuring the orcs could not bring their numerical superiority to pay as well as they liked. Atop the sheer cliffs of the pass, Sigmar, King Kurgan, and the tribal kings posted archers, javelin throwers, and others charged with raining down death upon the orc advance and engaging any skirmishers seeking to make prey of the army's unguarded flanks. The Turingian berserkers were the first warriors to charge across the field, matching the orcs' blood-curling roars with their own. King Otwin was first to wet his axes in black blood, the already incredible ferocity of his warriors boosted by potent herbal infusions, driving them to untold heights of bloodlust. The Turingians reaped a hefty toll of orc skulls, and their assault proved effective enough to cause the orc line to waver, and the Turingian flying wedge had torn its way deep into the enemy's heart. Queen Freya and the Assaborns were the second to engage the orcs. Sigmar had anticipated Otwin would throw himself into battle at the earliest sight of the foe, and had thus entrusted Freya to guard the life of the Turingian king. The berserkers fought magnificently, but like the jaws of some trap, the orc ranks surrounded and butchered them. The charge of the Assaborn chariot was devastating, and the valor of the warrior women caused the orcs to break ranks and flee. A following cavalry charge was enacted by Sigmar's army. This was the end of the first phase of the battle, which saw the first orc wave defeated. Imperial historians assert, and are supported by several ancient tapestries of the battle, that the charge of the Imperial cavalry marked the first ever use of the couch lance. Now that the orcs knew the resolve of the tribes, they charged en masse in lines spanning the width of the pass, roaring and eager to face men so skilled in battle. The dwarven army of King Ironbeard met their ancient foes with the hatred of 1,000 generations of anguish and loss at greenskin hands, slaughtering scores of orcs without remorse with an almost mechanical efficiency as their mighty Gromril axes and hammers sliced off limbs and crushed bones. King Kurgan and his iron breakers fought in the very center of the battle, and the dwarven king slew the mightiest black orcs with gleeful abandon. laying about his people's ancestral foe with the full depth of his anger. Yet the battle was never in doubt, for while men and dwarfs overcame the orcs in courage and skill, they were but a thin line of iron ready to break at any time against the numbers of the greenskins. In the thick of battle, Sigmar was overwhelmed by orcs and trolls, bereft of his mighty warhammer. Seeing the king's distress, his ally, Marbad of the Andals, did cleave his way to Sigmar's side and threw his elvish sword to him. With Ulfshard in hand, Sigmar cut down his foes, but was too late to save his brother king, for without his own blade, Marbad could not defend himself against his assailants. The valiant Andal king had thus sacrificed his own life for that of Sigmar's. Realizing the battle would soon be lost until action was taken, and fury burning brightly in his heart at the death of his dear friend, Sigmar gave orders to Alfgeir to assemble the other kings and watch the eagle's nest. As Sigmar leapt from the high rock, his warhammer raised high, all who saw it knew the sight would stay with them forever, as Sigmar fell towards the orcs with a bestial roar, like a hero of the ancient sagas. The king of the Unbroggan slaughtered all about him, each blow delivered with a howl of rage, animal to the core. He killed and killed without thought, seeing before him only the enemies of his race and the desolation of the blasted east encroaching upon the peace and plenty of the west. Who can say whether this unmatched show of arms was a means of inspiring the army to victory, or whether Sigmar truly intended to defeat the orcish horde single-handed? All that matters is that here he is where the tide turned, as Sigmar utterly destroyed every orc he beheld, Galmeraz filling him with hate, his fury armouring him in thunder, and mighty Ulrich pouring lightning into his veins. 100 orcs were dead around him, their circle breaking as they scrambled away in utter fear of this blooded, crazed human more ferocious than any of them. Seeing this great warrior press through the orc ranks, the vile warlord of this host, Urglak Bloodfang, tore through his own warriors to test his strength in honourable combat against this strange human king. Descending upon his great wyvern, the orc brought his axe to bear against Galmeraz, but the master of the empire smote his winged beast and forced the brutish warlord to face him as an equal. After a long, brutal contest of strength, Sigmar disarmed Bloodfang and brought the ancestral warhammer of the dwarf kings down upon his head, destroying his skull utterly. Tired and spent from the battle, Sigmar saw the orcish warriors stare at him, first with awe at his victory, and then with predatory looks as they gathered around to finish what their master had started. His hammer now slipped from his grasp, and with no other weapon at hand, Sigmar could not defend himself. A white-shafted arrow punched through the visor of one orc, and then another followed until a flurry of arrows thudded into the orc ranks, followed by roars of triumph. The rest of the army had broken through, and the warriors of the empire charged forth to protect their leader. Assaborn warrior women shrieked as they tore the orcs to pieces alongside Unbroggan, Teutogan, Cherusans, Andals, Merregans, and Menogos. Turingian berserkers rushed headlong into the deteriorating orc lines and slaughtered like madmen, with Udosi's clansmen not far behind. With their warlord dead, the terrible and awesome will binding the fractious orc tribes together was destroyed, and they could not mount an adequate defense against this onslaught. Old jealousies and rivalries erupted, and the orcs turned upon each other even as they routed, slaying each other in order to speed their personal retreat from the jaws of death. Within moments, the once indomitable orc army was little more than a panicked, fleeing mob. With the defeat of the orcs at Blackfire Pass, the security of the lands of the 12 tribes was assured. King Marbad was afforded the funeral rites of the greatest heroes, for such he deserved, and was carried onto his pyre by his fellow kings and his heir. Not only was the race of men saved, but so was the dwarven domain. In heartfelt gratitude, King Kurgan Ironbeard pledged that he would charge Alaric with the creation of 12 magnificent blades in thanks to the Empire for their shared brotherhood. These blades would later be known as the 12 rune fangs of the Empire, which continue to be wielded by the Counts of the Empire to this day. After the battle, Sigmar's fame spread wide and far, renowned as a hero. Upon the anvil of war and the fires of battle, at last his dream of a united empire had been realized, for men of all tribes had stood together in the battle line as brothers. With the truth of their common enemy now made obvious, the old tribal hatreds had evaporated away, replaced only by iron-hard ties of brotherhood, bathed in blood. With the victory, it is said that the kings and then their tribesmen all dropped to a knee within the pass before Sigmar, accepting him as their new lord. Thus, the Empire was at last created. With the monumental victory of the Blackfire Pass under his belt, Sigmar Heldenhammer was now renowned throughout the lands of men as perhaps the greatest hero to have ever graced the annals of the tribes. The hammer of the goblins, who had finally ended their destructive invasions, who had brought together the tribes of men in absolute brotherhood. Now, all that remained was to be formally crowned, and as a fiercely devout worshipper of Ulrich, there was only one individual in the land who lay upon Sigmar's brow the crown of Emperor. A warrior perhaps even greater than he, the very incarnation of the god Ulrich upon the mortal coil. The Jarl Ulrich. Before the oath stone of Reichdorf, in view of his brother kings, Sigmar knelt before the mighty war priest, showing all his reverence for the Lord of Winter. The Jarl Ulrich saw within Sigmar's soul a thirst for immortal glory, a drive to rival even the mighty deeds of his god. His lust for glory and immortality sat in equality with his devotion to Ulrich, and that this glory would be gained through battle. This Jarl Ulrich knew pleased the wolf god. As a final test of his worthiness, Jarl Ulrich bade Sigmar submerge himself within the icy waters of the Cauldron of Woe. If he could survive the cauldron's judgment and prove his strength, then would the warrior priest bless his coronation. Sigmar descended into the waters, and despite the deathly cold nearly killing him, he emerged from it by sheer strength of will. Satisfied by the king's performance, and requiring no further demonstration, Jarl Ulrich commanded Sigmar to kneel, so that he may place the dwarven crown brought forth from Alaric's forge upon his brow and declare him the supreme master of the empire. Sigmar's first decree was to abolish the old status of king, and introduce the station of count. In practice, this decree changed very little. It was primarily a means of reinforcing the subordination of the tribal chieftains to the emperor, but in truth it left the powers of the individual chieftains more or less intact in so far as their ability to govern their own respective peoples, though the emperor of course retained the ability to impose himself on any of their affairs as he saw fit. No single man, Sigmar had decreed, could or should govern a domain as vast as the empire. Instead, any man who sought to rule would do so through the aid and support of his brother kings, who also retained the power to remove the emperor, as well as his appointed heir, from power if it became obvious that the current incumbent was unworthy of command. The formal process of election did not become a part of the count's powers until after Sigmar had abdicated the throne in his 50th year of rule. Sigmar's second decree, immediately afterwards, was to declare his native Reichdorf as the capital of the new empire. The foundations of the realm were now laid, but the true test of securing it was now at hand. Yet it was at the night of his glorious victory celebration that Sigmar spoke to the old hag witch for perhaps the last and final time. The old hag told the noble emperor of his last prophecy, of the impending doom that is to come should he not learn to control the darkness which lurks within the hearts of all men. If he fails, then all that was achieved would be in vain, and mankind will once more plunge deeply into the darkness which lurks within their very hearts. In the wars to come, the old hag asked Sigmar to ensure that the warrior eternal must live, lest his death shall spell the beginning of the end. With her prophecy given, Sigmar collapsed onto his bed, sleep dragging him down to its warm embrace. When the Emperor next woke, Sigmar made ready to ensure that his empire was secured from the evil which would come upon his realm. His first act was to go to the kingdom of the Andals and reassure the loyalty of Count Aldred, son of the late King Marbad, who sacrificed his life to save Sigmar during the Battle of Blackfire Pass. From there, Sigmar valiantly slew the marsh demons which inhabit the outskirts of the city, freeing the Andals from the curse of pestilence and reassuring the loyalty of Count Aldred to Sigmar's cause. With the Andals' loyalty finally secured, Sigmar launched an invasion of the Teutones tribe, which lasted for 2 years. This culminated with the siege of Teutonsric, which ended with an imperial victory over the Teutones. Marius, left with no other recourse, pledged his sword oath to Sigmar. The emperor left a force comprised of differing tribes, comprised of those who had not been involved in taking the city, as Sigmar feared the warriors would exact vengeance upon the city for the men lost in the siege and tax the city of Teutonsric heavily for a period, portioning off the income to the imperial army as a reward. After dealing with the Teutones and siphoning off 1/10 of the city's riches towards those warriors who partook in the siege, Emperor Sigmar was moved to take account of a dreaded evil stalking the shadows of Middenheim. There, Sigmar was presented with the horrors of a necromancer that had taken residence within the Middle Mountains, in an old fortress known only as Brass Keep. Knowing that such evil could not stand to live within his empire, Sigmar led a war host towards the mountains bearing the dragon banner of the Unbrogans, a symbol which dictated that no mercy or quarter would be given to the enemies of the empire. The army continued on its way, marching higher into the soaring peaks, winding a treacherous course through icy valleys and mist-shrouded gorges as they climbed high above the snow line. Sigmar chose their course without truly understanding what guided him, for this region of the north was little mapped, and few had travelled this way and lived to tell of it. It felt as though the coldest wind in the world blew from the heart of the mountains, and Sigmar was merely following it, like an explorer tracing the course of a river back to its source. At each fork in the landscape, Sigmar would strike out without hesitation, leading his army deeper and deeper into the unknown. Scouts reported signs of greenskins and other dangerous monsters dogging their course, but none dared attack so numerous a body of warriors. Finally, the army reached the frozen valley which held Brass Keep. As the army walked through the frozen lake which filled the valley floor, Sigmar and his entire host saw beneath the thick sheet of ice a massive derelict city of towering spires and abandoned temples. Yet for all its glory, it was a dead place, a mockery of a city where lives were lived and dramas, both vital and banal, were played out on a daily basis. It was the city of Morkar, and it stood as a grim reminder to the necromancer of his former home before it fell many thousands of years ago. A cold gust of wind through the army as the necromancer appeared atop a bone-white tower behind the walls of Brass Keep. The war host of Emperor Sigmar charged through the frozen lake as the gates to Brass Keep came wide open. Yet in their path stood a whole army of undead monstrosities conjured by the foul sorcery of the necromancer. Yet despite this, Sigmar, with his golden hammer shining with golden light, illuminated the army's path towards the citadel. As the magics of the keep dissipated, it revealed Brass Keep to be nothing more than a derelict husk of its former glory. Only the tower remained as it was, and was there that Sigmar fought the necromancer, known in ancient times as Morath of Morkar, and hurled him down from the tower. Yet as he basked in his triumph, a golden shine reflected itself from a magnificent crown which the necromancer once wore. Picking it up from the ground, golden light flowed from the crown and into Sigmar, healing him of his burdens and pain. Believing the crown to be powerful and benevolent, Sigmar forsook the crown made by Alaric and took this one as his new badge of authority, never truly understanding the evil which sat deep within its unsundered core. Though Sigmar and his allies had driven the Norssei from the lands of the Empire to their bleak dwellings in the north, there was never any doubt that the sea-wolves would one day return to wreak their terrible retribution for the loss of their lands. In IC, barely a decade since they were driven back, the Norse raids restarted with a vengeance. In the aftermath of their defeat at Sigmar's hand, the issue arose of what was to be done with the Norssei lands left lordless, their occupants fleeing back to the far north. Most of the surrounding tribes were too fearful to settle them, as the memory of the Norssei depredation loomed long in their memories, and the lands themselves were said to be cursed by the Norssei's cruel veneration of the dark gods, the listless spectres of the thousands sacrificed upon their altars and pyres haunting the land. In the end, it was the Ropsmen, a northerly tribe so far removed from the rest of the Reich that they were, to an extent, almost as much of a different race unto the other tribes of the Reich Bassin as the Norssei themselves, who mustered the courage to assimilate the Norssei lands. This proved to be their undoing. The Norssei regathered their strength in the north, and the tribes became unified under the leadership of a mighty warrior king whose very name bespoke the naked brutality of the Northmen, Cormac Bloodaxe, chieftain of the Iron Wolves clan and champion of Khorne, son of the slain High King of the Norssei, Varag Skulltaker. Under Cormac, the Norssei launched a vicious series of raids upon the Ropsmen and their new holdings, destroying various settlements and kidnapping their women and elderly and holding them as ransom, extracting from the Ropsmen a season's worth of servitude. Their next act was to tear the throat out from the Udosei tribe, launching a raid upon the great city of Hogvik and the castle of Salzenhus. Joined by the Ropsmen, the Norssei slaughtered the inhabitants of the Udosei's capital, including the royal family of the clan, thus plunging the Udoseis into disarray as the beleaguered tribe fell into succession crisis. With the defense of the north shattered, the Norssei went on to further threaten imperial holdings further inland. Under the advice of his shaman, Kar Ordaken, Cormac Bloodaxe limited his raids to the purposes of psychological warfare and spreading fear amongst the Imperials. Tales of countless warriors butchered like sheep, and men and women and children alike left impaled upon great stakes in honor of the Norssei war god, spread like wildfire amongst the hearth fires of Imperial inns and villages, sapping the courage of defenders with every retelling. In time, sagas of Cormac's victories reached back to Norska and the Chaos Wastes, drawing many tribes of Northmen to his banner. Even tribes amongst the Kurgan and Hung, hearing tales of a Norssei king's valor and exaltedness before the gods, made the journey to the west and pledged their lives to Cormac's service. As his numbers swelled, so too did Cormac's thirst for vengeance, and soon the burning fire of revenge in his heart propelled him to take the fight south after a year of raiding. When Emperor Sigmar heard of what had befallen the Udoseis and the fate of Count Wulfila, a creeping darkness soon began to take over. Wulfila was one of Sigmar's closest friends and allies, and to hear of his death and the death of his family struck him deeply. Demanding the dragon banner to be held up once more, the emperor gathered a mighty host of warriors to avenge the death of Count Wulfila. Made most Udoseis, these vengeful clansmen had taken bloodthirsty relish in the war, killing all before them with hearts hungry to avenge the death of the Count and their own people. The stories of his death had been told and retold so often that the truth was lost, and the horror of what the Ropsmen were said to have done grew to ridiculous levels. Marching east, Sigmar put to the torch every single Ropsman settlement he could find, and at the Battle of Roskova, nearly 3,000 Ropsman warriors had been killed on that blasted day, and there had been no mercy for the wounded. Twice more they had brought the scattered Ropsman warrior bands to battle, and each time Sigmar ordered the bloodthirsty banner raised. The slaughter had been terrible, and the screams of the dying and images of burning villages haunted the dreams of those that did not relish in the slaughter. At last, what remained of the Ropsman people huddled in terror on the muddy banks of the river Linsk. 100 Ropsman warriors in iron aubergs and bronze helmets tried to impose some order on their people's flight across the river, but it was a hopeless task. The horror of their tribe's destruction overcame any thought other than escape, and braving the still forming ice was preferable to annihilation at Sigmar's hands. As a portion of the ice gave way, dozens of people were plunged into the sluggish black water. Weighed down with all their worldly possessions, they did not return to the surface. Weeping mothers tried to pull their crying children away from the holds, watching as families drowned in front of their eyes. The sight was a heartbreaking scene to witness, and only Sigmar and the Adosis seemed to not care. In a span of a few months, less than 1,000 is all that remained of them. Unable to stand idly by any longer, Sigmar's childhood friend Pendrag came to Sigmar and desperately tried to reason with him. Sigmar would not be deterred, but Pendrag was Sigmar's friend, and he did not fear his wrath. With words, Pendrag told Sigmar what he needed to hear, of what he was doing today was not him, and that he needed to stop this right now. Deep inside, Sigmar fought to control this unreasoning hatred which filled his every thought, his body shaking with effort until Sigmar finally saw through the haze, tears flooding down his cheek even as his face was twisted with hate. Finally, Sigmar allowed the survivors to flee, and Sigmar returned home with his warriors. Yet no sooner had Sigmar returned to his city of Reichdorf that the same darkness which haunted his mind came back stronger than ever. With Galmeraz and Alaric's crown given to Pendrag for safekeeping, there was nothing that could deter the voice in his head. As the voice began to feed his darker emotions, Sigmar's thoughts of compassion and mercy were replaced with distrust and rage. When Sigmar heard that the Turuzen and Telutans once more raided each other's lands despite Sigmar's demands, the Emperor forcibly brought the two counts into chains and placed them upon a hay wagon bound for the marshes. Sigmar's mind ached with conflicting thoughts and emotions. As much as he knew that what he was doing was very wrong, the rage that fed his urge to kill pulsed like fiery waves in his skull, blotting out any thoughts of compassion. So vile and bitter was this rage that he did not even recognize it as his own. Sigmar had known anger in his life, but this rage had been nursed for thousands of years, a hatred that had grown to such immense proportions that Sigmar's mind recoiled from such darkness. Yet despite this, a wave of calming warmth blocked out Sigmar's consciousness, and the darkness reassumed control. Upon the marshes, the Emperor presented to the counts their deaths, but not just any death, but one he believes is fit for all traitors. For a man to die by the thrice death upon the marshes would deny him his journey onward to the next world, a fate spent eternally in damnation. Yet as the sword was ready to fall, once again another of Sigmar's childhood friends, Wolfgard, intervened and demanded Sigmar to fight against this darkness. Soon the two friends came to blows, and as Sigmar was ready to strike down his friend, a body soon surfaced upon the stagnant waters. In mere moments, Sigmar saw the face of the old hag woman, and in turn her eyes were open, and they stared directly at Sigmar. Sigmar cried out as he saw himself reflected in the hag woman's eyes, sitting astride his oldest and dearest friend with murder in his heart. For the briefest instant, he did not recognize himself, the drawn, parchment-skinned monster that revelled in bloodshed and the pain of the living. Now Sigmar knew what the old hag had told him all that time ago. In that instant, Sigmar's true self saw the darkness within the crown, reliving all the evil that he had caused, and the revulsion and horror it induced upon him snapped Sigmar back to reality. Sigmar sobbed when he came to, yet as he was about to remove the crown, fiery agony exploded inside his head as the vile entity tried to forcibly take control. Screaming with agony, the weeping Sigmar ran off into the marshes, where every step he took, the entity tempted Sigmar with all his greatest desires. As Sigmar slowly sank into the marshy waters, his mind fighting desperately against this entity, it would seem that all was lost. And through the darkness, Sigmar heard first the voice of his lover Ravenna, and then his beloved father Bjorn, and through their words, Sigmar found the strength to wake up from the darkness and remove the crown from his head. The last of his strength, Sigmar ripped the crown free from his head and swam for the surface, but his body was tired beyond reckoning. As darkness soon enveloped his vision, it seemed to be over, if not for a strong pair of hands which hauled Sigmar out of the murky waters. Bloodied, Wulfgard and Sigmar embraced each other, and Sigmar, seeing the errors of his ways, begged for forgiveness. Wulfgard said that it was the crown's doing, and after returning Galmaraz and Alaric's crown to Sigmar, the Emperor made ready to do what was right. Sigmar locked the crown away in the deepest, darkest chamber beneath the temple of Shalia, and asked Count Aloysius and Count Krugar for forgiveness. With everything set right, Sigmar geared the Empire for war. Far to the north, the Theodosies regrouped and set aside their clannish bickering to set a new chieftain, Con Carsten, as war chief. Under Carsten's leadership, the Theodosies organized themselves and, under orders from the Emperor, waged guerrilla warfare upon the Norssei juggernaut, slowing its advance. But for Carsten and the Theodosies, the north would have surely fallen to the Norsemen, and the time bought by his efforts allowed Sigmar to muster a sword host drawn from the Turingian, Teutgen, Teutone, and his own Unberogen. The battle with the Norssei army ensued just 50 miles off the southern coast of the Sea of Claws. The imperial army was broken into several tribal contingents, each led by a count. The imperial army marched into battle under a carefully drawn plan, their courage bolstered by the mythical presence of the Emperor, and tales of blood and glory that each man would boast of in the halls of their tribes already took form in their minds. Little did they know that victory would not come easily, for while the Imperials thought to defeat their ancient adversaries in a single pitched battle, the shaman of the Norssei called down lightning from the skies, arcing through the ranks of the white wolves as the Imperials floundered. The Norsemen advanced under the skull banner of their king, fighting with the savagery, courage, and ferocity for which they were legendary, but also, most alarmingly of all, with a plan. Instead of the usual berserking and masses of charging warriors, the Norse gave battle in imitation of Sigmar's army, marching in tightly packed ranks with hitherto unheard-of cohesion. Supplementing the Norse warriors were the swift horse-masters of the Kurgan and Hung. The dark-skinned tribesmen encircled the Turingian vanguard under King Otwin and hammered them with deadly arrow shots. Odwin's advance floundered, and the Norssei cavalry, mounted upon tall, dark steeds larger and more ferocious than any horse of the Reich, charged thunderously into the Turingians, led by a towering warrior in dark armor wielding a flaming axe, Cormac Bloodaxe himself. The Norssei hacked down the Turingians without mercy. Teutone lancers managed to hold back the Norse horsemen for just long enough to save the dying King Otwin, who had taken a lance through his chest. Sigmar's strategies had been met and countered at every turn, his warriors thrown back time and time again. For the first time in his life, the Emperor knew the bitter taste of defeat. Realizing the battle could not be won, Sigmar ordered the army's clarions to sound the retreat. In the end, however, the very same savagery that made the Norssei so fearsome proved to be the salvation of the Empire, for at the battle's end did the Norssei's new-found discipline finally gave way to their barbarity, and the champions of Norssei led their tribes in an orgy of slaughter amongst those too slow to heed the call to retreat. Over 1,000 Imperials were slain in the battle, the Norssei losing a mere 300 warriors. Such was the price paid for underestimating the cruel Northmen. Realizing the Norse were now undefeatable in open battle, Sigmar withdrew his forces to Middenheim, the greatest fortress in the old world, where the armies of the Empire could wait out the Norse long enough for reinforcements from the other tribes to reach the battlefield. Though Cormac Bloodaxe had intended to encircle the Fauschlag and isolate and pick off Sigmar's reinforcements, the influence of his lieutenants, Ka or Daken, and Azazel, Geryon of the Unbrogen, who after attempting to kill Sigmar fled to the Norssei lands and accepted the worship of Slaanesh, becoming a Chaos champion, led to him leading the Norssei in a siege of Middenheim, the Wolf's City. Middenheim at the time was not a fully constructed city. The great chain lifts that provided easy passage up the mountain were not yet completed, and the viaducts could be easily held by the warriors left to the Empire. Had this been the end of the matter, the outcome of the siege would never have been in doubt. Unfortunately, there were other paths into the mountain that were not counted by either man or dwarf. When Arthur had enlisted the aid of the dwarfs in building the city, they found the Fauschlag honeycombed with tunnels and caverns wrought by hands unknown even to them. These hidden passages, too, had to be defended. The bright lure of the flame of Ulrich brought the followers of the dark gods to it like moths, just as the Emperor anticipated. With 8,000 warriors drawn from the tribes, he would now hold Middenheim against the darkness. Pendrag, his sword brother and Count of Middenheim, stood at the northern battlement alongside Mercer the Eternal Warrior, facing towards the homeland of their enemies as tradition dictated. Below, the Norssei warriors brought the halves of their mighty axes banging against the bosses of their shields in a rhythmic boom. The droning arose, reaching up to the lofty perch, as the Norssei chanted songs of war and the names of their dark gods and ancestors, the roars of the bestial monsters accompanying them, completing the dreadful symphony. It was a noise that spoke of destruction for its own sake, the need to seek battle only for the death it would cause. Here was why Sigmar had to drive the Norssei out of the Empire, for where the folk of the Empire sought peace and the warmth of hearth and home, the Norssei craved battle and conquest. Where progress and development were the watchwords of the Empire, the men of the North were driven by slaughter and the lust for domination. The gods of the South offered protection and plenty for those who honored them, while the baleful gods of chaos demanded veneration and offered only war and death in return. The siege was brutal, lasting for several days. Brutal Norssei charges were thrown back but barely, and each time did the Norse reap a hefty toll from the defenders. The enemy dead were thrown from the viaduct, and the screams of the wounded warred with the frenzied battle chants of the Northmen. Sigmar and his personal guard threw the Northmen back several times, and each time did Sigmar slay dozens of Norssei champions who sought the honor of taking his head. The Northmen threw themselves into battle, slaying hundreds with renewed fury as the power of their gods blazed through them and imparted them with strength. It was destructive power that saw them away in the end, but not a one of the Norse feared such a fate. In the center of the Norssei shield wall was a great war altar dedicated to corn. a towering thing of brass and blood and blades which invoked the ancient power of that deity. Realizing that the battle could not be won unless this dreadful altar was destroyed, Sigmar fought his way through the Norssei ranks, leading a squad of Turingian berserkers, the vaunted warriors of the King's Blades, Count Otwin's own personal cadre. Sigmar then cast down the blasphemous construction with his own hands. Below the city, in the caverns and tunnels, Wulfgard and a number of volunteers held the hidden pathways against the invaders. The Skaven, seeing a chance to eradicate the race of man under the cover of the Norssei invasion, attacked those ancient tunnels of their making and assailed the Imperials. However, a contingent of dwarfs under Alaric the Mad relieved the Imperials and held off the tunnels against the Chaos Ratmen, freeing up Wulfgard and his warriors to aid the defense of the city. The Theodosi's and Teutone defenses on the eastern and western side of Middenheim were broken, and the Norssei managed to stream into Middenheim, held back only by the disciplined guerrilla tactics of the city's reserve defenders, led by a grizzled veteran of 50 years named Magnus Anders. The first day of the siege was thus concluded. Another 1,000 Imperials were slain holding the city, including 200 Theodosi's. Alaric brought 500 warriors from honorable clans, including hammerers from the personal guard of King Kurgan Ironbeard. However, he also brought with him the first of the Runefangs, which would be known as Bloodbane for its part in the siege. For 12 days the siege continued, with neither side able to gain a lasting victory over the other. Yet the fact that they had held out so long had given the defenders hope that they could overcome these northern madmen. However, the Norssei had one final hand to play. Cormac Bloodaxe, who had slain so many in the siege that his blade was so thick with blood it could never be cleansed, stood atop a great altar the Norsemen had erected in honor of Khorne. Cormac knew the work of his god was to be done that day, for he had woken seeing the world in blood. Around him, the greatest warriors of 8 tribes stood and ritualistically slit their throats in honor of Khorne, allowing their blood to pool at the offering site. With this, Khorne saw fit to take Cormac up and reforge him as an avatar of his rage, a demon prince. With Cormac's ascension, the Norsemen fought with brutal fury, their monstrous war cries now even more hideously animalistic than that of the beastkin who fought at their side. Such was their ecstasy for fighting alongside a chosen manifestation of one of their gods. To the Norse, the viaduct was all that mattered now, as they abandoned their efforts to carry the western and eastern battlements. From the edge of the forest, the beasts howled their encouragement as the men of the north fought alone, now to take Middenheim. The ascended Norssei king led the charge, smashing apart the walls of the city and hewing apart hundreds with fell sweeps of his flaming axe. It made its way to the flame of Ulrich, where Sigmar stood ready to oppose him. Long did Sigmar and Cormac face each other before the great silver flame, and neither could overpower the other. Meanwhile, Count Pendrag fought the Norssei on the walls, crossing blades with Azazel Geryon. Though Pendrag was a great warrior in his own right, even armed with a runefang, he could not prevail against the champion of Slaanesh. Though slain by the traitor, Azazel was driven from the walls of Middenheim by the fury of Mercer, King Otwin, and King Marius. With his dying breath, Pendrag made his valediction and passed the mantle of Count to Mercer and offered him the runefang. With blade in hand, Mercer made his way to the flame of Ulrich and lent his aid to Sigmar, driving the runefang, now strengthened by the frozen winds blowing at Ulrich's command, into the demon prince while its back was turned. Though the dreadful energy sustaining the demon overcame the sword, the distraction proved enough for Sigmar to imbue his hammer in the flame and scale to the monster's head, bringing the wrath of Gal Maraz down upon it. The demon lord screamed in anguish as the sky was rent asunder and was thrown back to the realm of chaos in a tempest of winter storms. With this act, the fate of the Northmen was finally sealed, and the Empire once more pushed back the darkness from their lands. The victory of Middenheim was an epic triumph to behold. Tens of thousands of warriors littered the battlefield and causeways of the grand fortress city from horizon to horizon. Like a storm-blown tide, the flame of Ulrich spread through the city, a blazing, seething river of blue fire that echoed with the howls of wolves and frozen winds. It did not burn, yet it roared with the hunger of a mortal blaze, and nothing it touched would ever be the same. A towering pillar of winter fire lifted from the heart of the city, spearing the furthest reaches of the sky and spreading its cold light across the land as far as the eye could see. The warriors of Middenheim howled as the power of their god touched them, and their eyes shone with the light of winter. Their blades were death, and the Norssei saw the defeat of the dread lord of Karnath in the cold, merciless eyes of their foes. At each man's side, whether Middenlander or not, a shimmering wolf of blue fire snapped and bit at the Norssei, tearing open throats and clawing flesh from bones with ghostly paws. No blade could cut them, no armor could defy them, and the phantom wolves tore into the Norssei with all the power of their master. Terror overcame the Norssei, and they scattered before the tide of fiery wolves and winter warriors. The viaduct became a place of certain death, with the wolves of the north and the men of the city hacking down their fleeing foes without mercy. Amid the howls of wolves and the screaming winds, there came another sound, a sound the defenders of Middenheim had almost despaired of hearing. Great horns, blowing wildly from a host of men. Then another army came from the forests, the swords of 10,000 men from all across the empire. From the east came the Assaborns, the Turingians and the Telutans. 1,000 chariots led by Queen Freya smashed into the Norssei, swiftly followed by the red skiffs of Count Krugar. Howling packs of Turingian wildmen fell upon the scattered beasts and men, their painted bodies glowing in the fire atop the Fauschlag rock. From the south came the Andals and the Burgundians and the Menegoths, warriors who had marched day and night to reach their emperor and fight at his side. The raven helms of the Andals rode down the Norssei fleeing from the viaduct, Count Aldred cutting a path through the northern tribesmen with arcing blows from Ulfshard. Princess Marika rode at midnight horse at her side, loosening arrows from a gracefully curved longbow. Merrigan's spearmen drove Norssei horsemen onto the blades of the Menegoths and the Burgundians, and Marcus and Sigurd relished the chance to lay waste to their enemies from afar. Ostrogoth blade masters cut down Norssei champions with sword blows that were as deadly as they were elegant, while Count Adelhard's kingly blade laid waste to any who dared come near. Within the hour, the Fauschlag rock was surrounded by warriors of the Empire, and the Norssei were doomed. By nightfall, the flame of Ulrich had retreated to the ruined temple, the winter winds and ghostly wolves returning once more to the realm of the gods. The Empire was saved, and the sacrifice of Count Pendrag was mourned by all, and most of all by Emperor Sigmar, Pendrag's closest friend. There would be righteous vengeance, and the men of the south were soon ready to see to it. Yet for now, it was a time of mourning, and a time for hearth and comfort. Vengeance had finally come. For long decades, the men of the south had endured the harsh depredations of the Northmen, and for so long the men of the south had been their victims, with whole villages burned and people killed, all for the sake of appeasing an uncaring pantheon of ancient and evil gods. Yet no more. This time there would be a reckoning, and there would be one soon. This was a righteous cause, for unlike the Robsmen who never truly sought the suffering of their fellow man, the Norssei revelled in it, and their death and destruction would only be a blessing to the world. Thus did Sigmar lead his empire against the Norssei once more. Great marauding fleets of warriors and raiders began to scour the coastline of Norska. Emperor Sigmar made the mistake of sparing the Norssei once. Now he was determined not to make the same mistake again, and soon Sigmar would finally enact his fateful vengeance against the man he once called brother. In time, tribe after tribe fell to the swords, axes, and spears of the southern raiders, whole settlements crushed by the righteous warriors of the HELDENHAMMER. In an ironic twist of fate, it was the Norssei who became the victims of raids, whilst the men of the south became the reavers from across the sea. There was no quarter for those they've killed, for the Norssei deserved nothing more than they got. Men, women, and children were butchered to the very last, and none wept a tear for their deaths. In time, fear began to creep into the hearts of all the Northman tribes, and now and forever the Norse would know that the Empire was a foe they would forever respect as their equal. Yet for all that Emperor Sigmar had achieved, he had yet to find the man known as Geryon, the man who killed Ravenna, and the man who betrayed not only him, but his entire people. It was sweet irony, then, that the last village he and his warriors put to the torch not only had the man the Emperor had sought for so long, but also that he once more escaped, and with him came a young boy, a boy who would in his later years become an even greater warrior than Geryon, now known as Azazel. This boy held the name of Morkar, and were it not for his friend Wulfgar to abandon the chase, perhaps the greatest threat Emperor Sigmar would ever know would have been averted, and once again Sigmar made another foolish mistake. Yet, even as the Empire breathed a sigh of relief and gloried themselves upon their achievements, the tribes failed to notice the cold winds of death blowing strongly from the south. Even as Sigmar basked himself in his triumphant homecoming victory far to the south, Count Marcus of the Menegoths was burying the body of his only son until a stranger appeared in the scene. He bore the caramel skin of Nehekara, yet there was a paleness to his appearance which contrasted with his own skin. In mere moments, the encounter turned violent, and a hulking undead warrior clad in chaos armor strode through the melee, butchering all of Count Marcus's warriors. Even as the end drew near, a dark, looming shadow appeared behind the two creatures, and as the tanned stranger choked the life out of the Imperial Count, Marcus knew his name, a name which was the very personification of death. The looming shadow was known as Nagash. Word didn't reach Sigmar about the Menegoths' destruction, at least not until the very same caramel stranger met the Emperor when he came to the woods looking for an ancient weapon known as an organ gun. There the stranger gave Sigmar an ultimatum: give up the crown of sorcery and serve the will of his master, or his empire shall perish under a flood of dead. Brave Sigmar rejected the creature's claims, and as the creature fled the scene upon a night-black hellsteed, the Emperor once again rallied the Empire for war. Yet the Empire needed time, and time was against them. As Sigmar rallied his knights and mustered his warriors, the capital of the Menegoths was razed to the ground by the invading hordes of Nagash. Worse still, mighty fleets of undead corsairs plagued the trade lines to the west, blocking off many ships heading towards the growing city of Jutonsvik. When Sigmar rallied the armies, he came upon the Cherusian settlement of Ostengard, now overtaken by the undead. Even as the settlement was purged, reports from all across the empire began to stream in that the dead were rising everywhere. Settlements from the southern Middle Mountains were abandoning their homes, and the refugees were streaming into Middenheim in a great flood. Western settlements had begun to be raided by beastmen and brigades as a foul pestilence and the onset of winter forced these creatures into desperation. Soon it became apparent that the final battle would take place within the gates of Reichdorf itself. Salvation and revelation came to the Empire when Sigmar's most trusted advisor, Eoforth, High Scholar of the Empire, delved deep into the great libraries of Reichdorf. There, a great many of the most useful tomes had come from the dusty library of Morath, the necromancer of Brass Keep, though copies of translated manuscripts from the far south had come to Reichdorf's great library via the Empire's southern kings. Oral tales told by traders returning from the southern lands of searing deserts or from across the world-edge mountains had been painstakingly compiled by the library's scribes. There, the scholar learned of the true nature of the being known as Nagash. Nagash was a figure only dimly recalled in ancient legends and the pages of dusty tomes to the men of the Reich. But Sigmar alone had known the truth of it, for when he faced the necromancer of the Brass Keep, he claimed from him Nagash's fabled crown of sorcery. Through it, the Lord of the Undead sought to entice Sigmar to be his champion, but his magic proved futile against Sigmar's will, who then placed the crown in a guarded vault under the care of Shalian priestesses. Inextricably linked with the tale of Nagash was the tale of the crown he had forged and into which he had bound the essence of his damned soul. This, the ancient tale-tellers agreed, was the source of Nagash's greatest power and his greatest weakness. The manuscript from the burning galley spoke of an ancient warrior named Al-Kadizar, who slew the Lord of Undeath with a dreadful sword of fell power and cast his bones and crown into a great river. A greenskin invasion had destroyed the city. Everywhere the crown appeared in history, great devastation quickly followed. Terrible invasions, cataclysms of dreadful power, corruptions of once noble civilizations into barbarism. The crown was a talisman of woe, a bringer of destruction that brought only misery and death whenever it came to light, and it was buried in the heart of Reichdorf. Driven with utter terror, the scholar rushed with all haste to bring this news to Emperor Sigmar before it was too late. Swollen by the Menegoth dead, the army of Nagash pressed further north and took the city of Sigurdheim in a matter of days. Thousands of undead warriors had marched up the rugged peak and broke through its defences, and the city fell in a night that held sway over the tribal territories of the cosmopolitan southerners. The Count, Sigurd, was slain in combat by a vampire and returned from death as a wight, just as his vassal, Count Marcus, had before him. Soon, for every victory won, the legions of the undead were growing to near apocalyptic numbers. It was not a mere whim that Nagash had divided his forces so, for he had sought to deprive the empire of its greatest strength, unity. His forces assailed every province, even as far as the great city of Middenheim. His purpose was not to destroy or conquer, but simply to keep the tribes from riding to the defense of their emperor, even as he rode hard to Reichdorf. Nagash's baleful eyes were turned upon the great capital, for he knew that his ancient crown and his final victory would be found there. The death of the Burgundians forced the Assaborns, close friends of the Burgundians, to move their hand, and began a muster of nearly 3,000 warriors and hundreds of charioteers. With their mighty warrior queen leading them, Countess Freya led her host south upon the banks of the river Styr, where the Assaborns met their foe and were utterly vanquished. What remained of Freya's forces returned to their capital of 3 hills, where they prepared themselves to leave and head to Reichdorf. Of the Assaborns, none had found Queen Freya. To the far west, upon the port city of Marburg, the armies of both the Endals and Teutones made ready to weather the assault of Nagash's undead fleet. Teutone lancers and Endal archers mounted the walls and battlements of the city when the first undead forces arrived. As the undead fleet made ready for landfall, a whole battery of catapults and ballistae sank ship after ship that came too close. Yet as the skies darkened with hordes of fell bats, the numbers of the dead soon overwhelmed the defenders, and in desperation, the Andals and Teutones were forced back into the mighty citadel fortress of the city, where they made their last stand. Sigmar, realizing that he could only coordinate the imperial armies from his seat at Reichdorf, rode from the victory at Ostengard to the capital, accompanied by Count Krugar's red skiffs. Along the way, Sigmar lifted the siege of the City of Three Hills, allowing what remained of the Assaborns to follow him to Reichdorf to reinforce the city's defences. Queen Freya had miraculously survived the depredations of Nagash's forces, and had fought her way through the Empire's infested southlands to her emperor's side at Reichdorf, adding to the defence of the city the remains of her shattered war host. And a contingent of dwarfs led by Master Alaric had also come west, both to aid their allies and to right a grudge upon one of Nagash's champions. Yet like a creeping sickness, the armies of Nagash spread throughout the empire, hordes of the dead enslaved to the will of the ancient necromancer like warhounds on a fraying leash, bound together by a web of dark sorcery with Nagash at its centre. The armies of the dead jealously strangled the life from the land of mortals. The southernmost reaches of the empire were already enveloped in darkness, but across the empire, scattered lights of resistance flared brightly against the encroaching shadow. The palisade forts of the Eudoci were besieged by corpses of ragged flesh, while other clans were pushed into bleak highland valleys where they fought desperate battles for survival. Count Carsten gave battle from the parapets of Wulfila's rebuilt castle, his army a patchwork of warriors from a dozen different clans. Welded together by the common foe, they fought as brothers, though they scrapped like bitter foes in times of peace. In the east, Count Adelhard led daring hit-and-run attacks against the dead, riding at the heads of glorious winged lances, whooping with excitement as they charged hither and thither through the ranks of the dead with wild abandon. People living in settlements that could be broken down at a moment's notice and loaded onto wagons for transport. The dead had no focus for their assault, and the Ostrogoth cavalry armies encircled and destroyed their enemies with ease. The Cherusans and Teutons took refuge behind the walls of their great cities. Krugar fought heroically on the spiked walls of Talahim, the great crater city that nestled like a giant eye in the enormous expanse of the great forest. Always where the fighting was thickest, Krugar hewed the undead with glittering sweeps of Utensial. Further west, Aloysius defended Hochregig with all the wild fury for which his kinsmen were famed. Forced to fight with every weapon available, many of the Cherusans chewed wildroot and drove themselves into bloody frenzies. Atop the spire of the Fauschlag rock, Mercer and his warriors hurled the dead from the walls of their soaring city. The cliff-like sides of the rock writhed with climbing horrors, yet the city still held. Mercer's rune fang shone with simple purity, and where it smote, the dead could not resist its power. Count Otwin's lands were near empty, his people scattered by the sudden invasion of the dead from the wastelands to the northwest. Long shunned by the living, these lands had vomited forth the ravenous tide of the dead that had driven the Turingians from their lands. Many now fought in Middenheim, or had since fled to Marburg. Teutonsric was a city of the dead, its streets empty of life, and infested with degenerate cannibal creatures. Even if this war against Nagash could be won, Jotunheim would forever be a forsaken and damned place, where no soul would seek to live again. Its great buildings and stone walls would fall into disrepair, and within the span of a lifetime, no one would know that men had once lived there. Further south in Marburg, the dead hurled themselves at the walls of a great citadel, but the defenders here were resolute and filled with determination to hold the line. Here, the power of the undead seemed weakest, as though a turning point in the battle for Marburg had been reached, and mortals now had the upper hand. Nevertheless, the cost was high, for Count Aldred no longer was amongst the living. When Sigmar returned to the imperial capital, he soon heard news that his scholars had found the necromancer's weakness before they were killed. Such was the price of knowledge. From his last dying breath, the Emperor found out that it was not some long-forgotten nemesis or weapon that would save the Empire, but rather a character trait that could be exploited. The great necromancer's every last thought was bent upon reclaiming his crown, and every step he took towards it fanned the fury of that desire. He would abandon all cunning and craft upon reaching Reichdorf, that he might claim it and fully restore himself at last. In that, Sigmar saw the chance to destroy the laws of the undead. He would place the crown of sorcery once more upon his brow, goading Nagash to face him in battle and try to take it from him. He would turn the necromancer's gift against him. The host of Nagash arrived before the walls of Reichdorf on the leading edge of dark storm clouds. Winter cut the air, and the cold winds that blew from the vast horde of the undead carried the stench of mankind's rot. Chain lightning flashed in the clouds, and rumbles of thunder that seemed to roll out from the distant lands echoed strangely from the walls of the city's temples, taverns, and dwellings. No sun rose on this day, the unnatural darkness covering the land in a bleak shadow from which it could never more be lifted, a gloom that entered every mortal heart and filled it with the sure and certain knowledge of the fate of all living things. Skeletons marched at the fore of the army, ancient warriors in serried ranks that stretched from one line of the horizon to the other. Cursed to serve Nagash for all eternity, they wore armor of long-lost kingdoms, clutched weapons of strange design, and the grave dirt of far-off lands clung to their bones. Heavily armored champions in heavy hauberks of scale and corsets of iron marched at their head, exalted warriors of the dead whose skill with the executioner's blades they carried was more terrifying than when they had been mortal. Where the warriors of bone resembled the army they had been in life, the thousands of bloody corpses dragged from shallow peasant graves or raised back from the dead in the wake of battle were a shambling mockery of life. Limping on twisted limbs and groaning with the torment of their existence, they were a stark reminder that even death in battle against this foe would be no escape from the horror. Hunched things in black robes moved through the shuffling hordes of corpses, their fell sorcery directing its mindless hunger. Yet even as death itself clung to the gates, Sigmar made one last pilgrimage to the Hill of Heroes, the last rest for the dead. There, Sigmar once more buried another of his close friends, as the body of Eoforth was finally laid to rest upon the bodies of those he had served and loved. Offering up a prayer to Mor, Sigmar's only wish was that his friend would see the next life in peace. As the offering was burned in the moonlight, a host of ghosts crept up on Sigmar, but these weren't malevolent spirits, but ones Sigmar knew all too well. Before him were all those he had loved and lost in his life, his father Bjorn and his close friends Pendrag and Trinovantes. The spirits came and took the body of Eoforth with them, each ghost slowly dissipating until only Bjorn remained. Bjorn pointed to Reichdorf, and Sigmar knew what he meant. "Know them, and understand them, for it will make you mighty." The words were not spoken, but Sigmar heard them as clearly as though his father had been standing in front of him. King Bjorn nodded, knowing that Sigmar had understood his message. He moved off into the darkness and was soon lost to sight as his shade returned to the realms beyond the knowledge of mortals. Sigmar sank to his knees, overcome with emotion. Galmeraz dropped to the ground, and he buried his head in his hands. He wept as memories of his father and friends surged to the fore, but they were not tears shed in grief, but in remembrance of all the joy they had shared in life. At last his tears were spent, and Sigmar stood tall as he turned to look at the city below, heartened by the thousands of pinpricks of light that glittered in the darkness. With pride he saw his people fight to the bitter end, and this flicker of hope was enough for the Emperor to finally face his true destiny at last. With a strong heart, Sigmar rallied the entire city to him, telling them of their proud heritage and the entire empire. Of all the tribes and of all classes, peasants, warriors and nobles sallied forth from the gates of their city to face the undead on the banks of the River Reich. Sigmar led the charge, his mighty hammer cleaving to and from. The momentum of the imperial charge was devastating, but slowly the tides began to turn, as the numbers of the dead soon outnumbered the living. As the battle raged, thousands more dead warriors were advancing towards the city, pushing past the tiny islands of resistance that had met with some fleeting success. The battle line of mortals arrayed before the walls was fighting with admirable courage, but no hope of victory. They took backward step after step, and it was only a matter of time before they broke. Soon, with a great surge of dark magic, Nagash invoked the dead from every yard within the lands, and thousands upon thousands more clawed their way to the surface. It seemed as if the Empire was finally doomed. Yet in the center of the battle, cut off from the rest of his army, Sigmar drove for the low hillside when Nagash awaited him. Less than 100 warriors still rode with the Emperor, yet they charged as though all of mankind was with them. Feeling the weight of the crown on his brow grow heavier with every step his horse took towards the hillside, Sigmar felt its anger at him surge, a fury that a mere mortal dared to wield it, and not dreams of pleasure, nightmares of failure, and temptations of wealth, power, and godhood. None could reach Sigmar, for he had reached that place where all thoughts of self were extinguished. All that was left to him now was service to his people, and not even death could keep him from that duty. Piece by piece, Sigmar had shed all his earthly desires, putting them aside for the greater good of the Empire. At his side was his dear friend, Wulfgard. The fearsome warrior's bravery in the face of countless revenants cleared a path for his lord through his enemies. Wulfgard's heroism allowed Sigmar to face Nagash in single combat. The Lord of Men and the Lord of Death, and great was Nagash's rage at seeing his crown worn by a mortal man, as well as his desire to at last claim it so that he could arise again from the ashes. Yet Nagash was a being far greater than even Sigmar could imagine, and though he had Galmeraz in his hand, the Emperor was struck by power so strong and magic so fell that he was forced upon his knees. As Sigmar stood on the threshold of death, trying desperately to hold against the dark will of Nagash, as all hope seemed lost, to the north, a great army of fanatics arrived at the horizon, and in that moment of distraction, Sigmar was freed from his will and took the crown off his brow. Nagash's greed led him to reach for his crown with outstretched fingers when Sigmar cast it off and goaded Nagash to take it. Such desire and obsession, such aching need and devotion. Nothing else mattered to Nagash, not the defeat of Sigmar's army, not the destruction of all living things. Nothing was more important to the necromancer than this crown. In this, just as the Heldenhammer had expected, Nagash had made his faux pas, leaving himself vulnerable for a thunderous sweep of Galmaraz. The mighty hammer of the dwarfs smashed into Nagash's cuirass, breaking it into 1,000 shards and powering into his chest. Green fire flared from the impact, and ribs fused with dark magic thousands of years old shattered like ice as Sigmar drove his hammer into the heart of the necromancer's being. Sigmar howled with the wolves and screamed his hatred of Nagash as the runic script on the hammer's shaft shone with the purest light. Runes he had not even known existed flared to life from the hammer's head, filling Nagash's hollow existence with fiery beams of light and searing his immortal essence from within. The necromancer shrieked as his ancient sorcery fought to resist the powerful magic of the dwarfs. Forces too titanic to be understood by mortals battle within his body, easily capable of laying waste to this entire land. Sigmar held onto Galmaraz as the star iron of its head burned brighter than the sun, and its grip burned his hands with its ancient fire. The necromancer gave one last shriek of horror, and his body exploded in a wash of black light and frozen fire. Dark magic and immortal energies flared upwards from his destruction like a volcanic eruption, and the sky filled with ashes and grief. With Nagash's apparent death, his army withered away without his magic to sustain them, nor was Nagash's influence confined to the dead Reitdorf, for the black strands of his web of control stretched all across the empire. The dead at Marburg dropped to the ground as the will driving them over the citadel walls faded into nothingness, while those clawing their way into Middenheim fell from the causeway and tumbled from the sheer sides of the Fauschlag rock. The Odosi watched in amazement as the dead ceased their attacks into their hidden valleys and crumbled to dust around the walls of Colncarsten's cliff-top fortress. The remaining stragglers were easily defeated without the necromancer's will to guide them, and the loss of the vampire leadership when Sigmar cast them away with a word, cursing them to be his enemies and the enemies of his heirs till the end of times. In the aftermath of the battle, realizing in his wisdom that the threats to assail his empire would be of a magical nature as well as mortal, Sigmar declared his intention to establish an order of the Empire's greatest warriors, a cabal known as the Order of the Silver Hammer, the direct precursors of the Holy Order of the Templars of Sigmar, as they were later known under the reign of Magnus the Pious, but more commonly known as the Witch Hunters. Sigmar's victory over Nagash would be short-lived, for soon after, the Emperor would face his last and greatest challenge. This ancient war had long been forgotten, and none truly know the true extent of its devastation. It was Sigmar's greatest triumph, the great struggle against the armies of the Norssei ever-chosen Morkar, the Uniter of the Talos tribe, who had risen to ascendancy in the eyes of the dark gods as the first of their ultimate champions. Charged with establishing the mortal realm as the kingdom of chaos, and thirsting for vengeance against Sigmar for destroying his clansmen during his reprisal raids against the north. Having gathered a great army from amongst the Norse and other races sworn to chaos, the Uniter led his host of warriors south. Little is known of the invasion, but it is clear that it was one of the most earth-shattering in all of the Empire's ancient history. Few of the wars of its modern age could possibly compare to its scale of devastation and destruction. With Morkar's victories, the powers of chaos surged from the north, bathing the world in the breath of the dark gods. With such power, the demons of the realm of chaos materialized in the mortal world, and marched alongside the ranks of the Norsemen. With each city that fell, Morkar avenged the long dead of his fallen tribe, thirsting only to cross blades with he who had led the charge. Eventually, Sigmar rallied the imperial armies and faced Morkar and his Norssei. Once more did the men of the south do battle against the indomitable warriors of the north. In the battle, Sigmar faced the terrible skull-taker of Khorne, and dealt a terrible blow upon the thing's vile head that saw it destroyed and banished back to Khorne's halls. Thus was Uzul defeated for the first and last time, forever carrying the legacy of his humiliation at Sigmar's hands upon his scarred horns. But little was this compared to the titanic duel between Sigmar and Morkar, and the mortal world has never before nor since seen the equal of that cataclysmic clash of titans. For a day and a night did Sigmar duel the champion of the northern gods, in a battle like unto that between gods themselves. The fury of their combat did rend apart the sky, and split the ground asunder with peals of thunder, strikes of lightning, and raging torrents of fire. The two avatars of the gods matched their arms in such glorious contest. At last they had found their equals. Regardless, the ever-chosen, though he had come closer than all others to ending Sigmar's life, was nonetheless defeated and struck down by the Emperor's mighty hammer. The destruction caused by the first of the great Chaos incursions was thus ended with Morkar's downfall, and thus his staggeringly mighty army was driven back to the north. Finally, at his 50th year of his reign, a great event would occur. In that year, Emperor Sigmar Heldenhammer, greatest of all of mankind's rulers, stood up from his throne, placed down his crown, and took up Galmaraz, and walked out of the great hall of his capital. He passed Wulfgar and his chosen bodyguard, who were roaring with laughter at some jest or remembrance of times past. He strode down the path towards the market square, where folk haggled and bartered with loud voices and good humour. He passed them, smelling roasting meat, and hearing the merry-making of children playing in the gutters, as he had done in his youth so many years before. Down the streets he walked, where men sat and gambled, or sparred with one another, and women-folk talked with babes on their hips, or prepared food for the next meal, or, having already cooked it, ate broth and beans out of earthenware pipkin balanced on their knees. Girls sat in groups, busy over fine embroidery. Sigmar saw life carry on in all its vibrancy as he walked by, unnoticed by all. Out through the iron-bound gate he walked, and down the well-worn track. Carts rumbled past, bringing trade and wealth into the town. On either side the fields were tended by men and women, sowing seeds from baskets hung around their necks. Children ran behind them, beating drums and yelling to frighten off the greedy crows that circled overhead. He saw sheep and goats grazing peacefully, overlooked by shepherds. Then into the forest he plunged, journeying eastwards towards the mountains. He passed foresters as they cleared the track of fallen branches and laid traps for game. They carried hunting bows and axes and were accompanied by their hounds. But the beasts did not pick up Sigmar's scent, who blessed them silently as he passed. When he emerged from the forest onto the eastward plain, he was no longer alone. On his left trotted a wild grey-headed wolf, and on his right was a giant boar with black tusks. As he set off up the hillside, they followed at his heels faithfully. The wolf with his wildness and courage, the boar with his wits and tenacity. When Sigmar reached the top of the hill, he turned. Before him, and sweeping out to the north and west, was the forest. Cutting through it in all directions were roads. Every town, village, and settlement was connected. Travellers and tradesmen moved like ants over them, spreading news and prosperity wherever they went. Troops of warriors tramped and cavalry cantered about the land, lending the populace protection from danger. Smoke rose high in the sky from the villages, which were burgeoning into towns, which in turn were growing into cities. And wherever Sigmar looked, he could see the strength of mankind grow. Through him, the tribes were united in a common cause. Enemies lurked everywhere, but together men would overcome them. Sigmar looked at what he had forged with his strength, cunning, and courage, and he knew his work had come to an end. It was time for others to take up his mantle and forge an indomitable empire. For the land and unity he had created was greater than any one man, any one dynasty. It belonged to the people it had been made for, and would be guarded by their strength, existing eternally in their minds and souls. They were all his heirs, who would take up his mantle and rule the land in his absence. Raising his mighty hammer in honor of the indomitable spirit of humanity and praise of Ulrich, who had, in his benevolence, granted him victory, Sigmar offered one final goodbye to the people he so loved. He had only one last journey yet to make. Behind him rose the heads of the World's Edge Mountains. He turned to them, and without a backward glance, marched towards his final destiny and his place earned through great deeds, unsurpassed courage, and much bloodshed and pain in the everlasting pantheon of the gods.